You're listening to a 3CR podcast of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to another episode of Radio MMT. How are you, Anne? How you doing?
Hello, Kev, and hello to our lovely listener. And thank you for joining us for the last episode of Radio MMT for 2024.
2024. We've been into this for nearly 2 years now.
Partway through the silly season, Kevin.
Yeah, and this is kind of like this is the slack part of the radio season where a lot of presenters don't really do much.
Slack off.
They slack off. And
Not us.
Well, we are, because we've got this huge clip we're going to play in the middle.
True.
So what do we have on the show this week, Anne?
Well, Kevin, I have found the answer to why bother with MMT or modern monetary theory. In fact, why do you and I even bother doing Radio MMT? And for me, that answer usually appears when I hear people talking about things like MMT and the Green New Deal, or MMT and a just transition, or MMT and ecological economics. And all of those other things, they're kind of telling us what we need to do if we're going to do something about this poly crisis. Maybe that can be our New Year's resolution for 2025.
Mine was going to be to cut right back on drinking.
That's Kevin's contribution. But MMT tells us how we're going to pay for what we're going to do. And so that'll be coming up, a nice big clip on all of the things that we can do once we understand our MMT. But before we got there, Kevin, I just wanted to mention this thing called the MIFO or the MIFO, the Mid-Year Economic and Fiscal Outlook.
Right.
Which I never paid attention to. So apparently this is when we're halfway through the financial year. So of course in Australia the financial year goes from July to June. So in December we're halfway through. So our treasurer has to give his report.
It's like a mid-financial year stock take, is it?
Yeah, something like that. And so Treasurer Jim Chalmers, he presented the MIFO on the 18th of December, and it contained the news that by the end of the budget year, so it'll be around June next year, Australia can expect a national budget with a, wait for it, $46 billion deficit.
Yay! We're getting back into deficit territory again. Most conventional people would think, oh no, we're a deficit. And when you say government deficit, I say private sector surplus. So what you're saying is that the government is going to stimulate the economy with an extra
$46 billion. Which I say is not high enough, Kevin.
The $46 billion question is, where does it go? Who gets that?
So you and I, Kev, we know that whether the government has a budget deficit or a budget surplus, it makes absolutely no difference to the ability of the federal government to spend on the things that we need. And so whether you're talking about a Labor government or a Liberal government or even a coalition, there is no such thing as the Australian government ever running out of Australian dollars.
There's been talk recently, with the Michelle Bullock and the Reserve Bank, etc., and they've been talking about things that have kept the economy afloat, like alive, with a pulse. And they've been saying that government spending has been a large part of that. But we've had governments running surpluses at the same time, which is to say that the net result for the government is that they have extracted more dollars from the private sector than they have put into it, because if they're running surpluses, that means they're shrinking the private sector. And yet at the same time, we have some of these orthodox economists saying that it's the government spending that is keeping things afloat. If the government wasn't spending, we would be in serious trouble.
So that could be right. You can still have a surplus even though the government's spending a lot, because it just means they're also taxing a whole lot as well.
Yeah, and my understanding is that they've been reaping it hand over fist from royalties from mining and
That's right.
and the extractive kind of area. So, if they're relieving these extremely lucrative extractive businesses of money, that's good. We like that. And if they're spending more into the economy, we like that as well. But if they are running a surplus, they could spend more. And it's not as if there's nowhere it could be spent. So yes, government spending has helped keep the economy afloat, but they should be doing more. And what we're learning with the $46 billion deficit is, they're going to put more into the economy than they're taking out. That's good.
And I just want to say shame to all those journalists and other pundits in the mainstream media who are feeding us rubbish under headlines like budget deficit blowout. That's pure propaganda. We can't run out of the dollars.
It's not complicated, Anne. I don't get it. This is really simple maths, Money in, money out. It goes from here to there. That's what's hard to understand about that.
And I think Jim Chalmers needs to know that no matter how much he boasts about delivering a surplus like he did last year, the Murdoch media will always pounce on him as soon as that inevitable deficit comes along. And the deficit is always inevitable.
We are on track to deliver the first surplus in 15 years, Mr. Speaker. Our responsible budget management is rebuilding our nation's finances and leading to smaller deficits and less debt and lower interest costs. The great irony of Australian politics is the Liberals talk about surpluses and the Greens talk about social housing, and in the last decade neither has delivered any of either. In fact, Mr. Speaker, those opposite delivered more consecutive deficits than any government since the 1920s. They delivered the biggest deficits since Federation, Mr. Speaker. It was a decade of debt, a decade of deficit, and a decade of disappointment. We take responsibility for cleaning up the mess that they left of the budget.
Yeah, and look, I'm dirty on the Labor Party for not even bothering to try and change the narrative. I reckon there are definitely people involved. I reckon Wayne Swan had half a clue, but he keeps on changing his position. One minute you think he understands it, and the next he says something which is totally contradictory. But this is not complicated, and I'm sure that there are people in Treasury, I'm sure that there are politicians who are attuned to this. They must know that they have an unlimited capacity to spend if the resources are available. And yet the Labor Party, for some reason, they want to play the same neoliberal orthodox game as the Liberals. They're never going to win that game.
No.
And they show no inclination to even challenge the narrative.
We have delivered back-to-back budget surpluses for the first time in nearly 2 decades. This is an economic record that we are so proud of. And more than that, it's the foundation for building Australia's future.
And that's what gets me upset. Is that, come on, just use some language to make this more palatable. It's not that hard because it's a very simple concept.
Well, I think Labor really should be focusing, like you said, on what we're spending on. And ideally, we're spending on supporting shared well-being in a healthy biosphere. And speaking of a healthy biosphere, Kevin.
Yes.
And all the stuff we can run out of, unlike the money, we can run out of our forests and we can run out of our carbon budget and the water in our rivers and clean air and all of that. So speaking of all that, Kevin, we have a bit of a treat today, which is we are going to listen to an extract from a podcast episode which was titled The Path to a Green Economy. And this was aired on the 15th of December 2024 on a podcast called The Sustainable Hour, and it was part of a special series called The Climate Revolution. And it is produced locally in Geelong and hosted by Mik Aidt. And in this segment, we will hear from Professor in Environment and Society, Dr Mark Diesendorf. We'll hear from Professor of Public Policy, Dr Marilyn Waring. And, of course, we'll hear from one of our favourite economists, Dr. Steven HailGlobal. So if you are wondering why bother with MMT, I'm hoping you will hear the answer in this.
Sit back, enjoy.
Welcome to this special edition of the Sustainable Hour. Those who've been listening to this series, The Climate Revolution, will remember that we have been talking about economy and culture before, and that was when we had Dr. Mark Diesendorf in the studio. It's about a year ago, I think, when he had just published a new book titled The Path to a Sustainable Civilization. Mark, let's get straight to it. How was your book received, and did that trigger something? And where's your thinking today now that a year has gone by?
Good day, Mick. To follow up on the book publication, my co-author and I have been giving talks around the country. And for the people who came to those talks, it's been very well received. However, we also tried very hard to get some publicity in the ABC and other mainstream media. And my university, the University of New South Wales, put out a press release that went everywhere. And would you believe the reaction was zero from the mainstream media? So for the people who are concerned, the reaction's been very good. But for the mainstream media, we've got a long way to go.
And so, Mark, a year has gone by, and has your thinking changed in that year?
My thinking has evolved quite a bit, and I've actually been working very hard in the past year. What's happened is, first on the academic side, I brought together a team of 5 sustainability scientists and 1 ecological economist, and with great difficulty, we have published a major paper in a leading international peer-reviewed journal, which is critiquing the current economic system. In particular, it's critiquing neoclassical economics, which is supposed to be the theory underlying neoliberalism, which is the ideology that governs the Australian government and most governments around the world. So that's only been published fairly recently, and it wasn't easy to find a journal, a leading journal that would publish it. So we're now waiting for reactions, because the reactions of conventional leading economists, usually first they ignore you, then they attack you, and as the saying goes, hopefully in the long run, then we win.
Yeah, I think we will win, Mark. It's only a question, how long time is it going to take before we win? So, Mark, what you're saying is, this economic system we have at the moment is rooted in this neoclassical economics. And that's the driving force behind all that destruction that we're witnessing, the climate breakdown, the flooding, the bushfires, the rising waters because of ice melting, and all that. As well as cost of living crisis and increasing inequality in society, with a very rich elite and a lot of people struggling at the bottom.
The economic system provides the false rationale for very powerful individuals and powerful corporations to continue to exploit the environment and to increase social inequality. And they do this by a number of myths or ideologies that they have spread, which have been unfortunately widely adopted by governments, oppositions, public service, and the media. One obvious example is the notion that endless growth on a finite planet is feasible and even desirable. And of course, this is a major source of environmental destruction. Endless growth in the use of energy, even if it's renewables, and the use of materials. But it gets worse. There are other ideologies. One is that we should shrink government and the public service and leave all our major decisions to the market. But the problem with that is, of course, that the market is controlled by the 1%, or even more specifically by the 0.1% of rich individuals and corporations. The market is not free. And that results in both environmental damage and social inequality. And I could go on. There are other ideologies. The notion that the market gives the value of everything. But of course, as we know, the market doesn't deal with unpaid work. It doesn't deal with some of the essential plants and animals in the environment that without them, we couldn't survive. Another myth is that wealth and income just trickle down from the rich to the poor, and that has been refuted by major empirical studies. For example, a recent one done for all the OECD countries, that is the relatively rich countries of the world, over a 50-year period. And that study finds that there is no gain if you give tax deductions to the rich. There is no gain in employment, and there's no gain in GDP if you believe that GDP is important for the economy. So it's one more of these ridiculous myths that dominate the system and, in fact, give license to those who control the market, to the rich and powerful individuals and corporations. They have license from these myths, from these ideologies, to continue with their destructive activities, whether it's environmental destruction, social inequality, or war, for example. And we mustn't forget the weapons industry that is helping to drive, is a major driver often of wars around the world.
So how do we measure what we really want? Someone who has looked deeply into that and written books about it is Marilyn Waring. She understands GDP and the flaws of GDP. GDP being the system that governments are using to measure our well-being in society.
And we should add that Marilyn Waring was previously a minister in the New Zealand government, and she's currently an academic in New Zealand.
GDP is a very poor indicator as a basis for public policy making. It's called a system of accounts, but in fact it doesn't have a debit side. So everything that is exchanged in the market, everything that is paid for, apparently adds to growth. And it doesn't even have to be legal to add to growth. So trafficking in people, drugs, armaments, endangered species, it's all great for growth. Motor vehicle accidents is fabulous for growth. You need new motor cars. Earthquakes are fabulous. You have to build new buildings. So it's a nightmare as a basis for public policy. It also treats the whole of the environment as if the environment just sits there available to be exploited, mined, deforested, polluted, whatever, as long as you're gaining market transactions. And of course, it leaves out the single largest sector of any nation's economy, which is unpaid work. And that unpaid work is overwhelmingly done by women, but men do unpaid work and children do unpaid work. They pretty much don't count subsistence work. In many countries, that subsistence agriculture is the basis of food security. It's not counted. And it means that most politicians as well don't understand GDP. It doesn't matter if they've done economics. People who do economics don't understand GDP. And they think that the only thing that they need is by the time the next election comes around, that they have to be showing that the growth figures are better, no matter how they achieve that. I learned all this as a very young politician put in to chair the Public Accounts Budget and Expenditure Committee. And I thought it was just something mad and nightmarish that New Zealand did. And then I subsequently found out, no, this was imposed on the whole world. So yeah, it's an inexorable major problem. And the other thing I really have an objection to is the idea that we'll move from something universally imposed like the GDP, and now we'll universally impose some wellbeing framework. And in Australia, with your 40,000 years of Aboriginal wellbeing and communities, and certainly in New Zealand with tangata whenua Māori, there isn't one way of being well. There are other ways of being well that shouldn't yet again be left out just because they're not Western and capitalist. So the very best public policy is going to be made when countries stop thinking that comparing ourselves with somebody else is the end target, as opposed to making really good public policy in this region or inside this nation state or with these peoples or whatever it is, and just not be afraid of that.
What's your alternative? What could come in strong and really replace this, and in a fast way? We don't have 100 years to wait for it.
No. When you break out of GDP and you go to something like time use, or you go to something like natural environmental indicators, or you go to asking populations about their well-being, then you do have to exercise judgment, but it's far more democratic, because now most of the population can not only access but understand the data that is being used for public policy formation and decision making. While it remains this opaque GDP nonsense, you effectively exclude 99% of the population from any participation, let alone understanding what on earth it's about. So you can democratise public policy making by finding these alternatives.
So, Mark, the really big question here is then, if we were to design a new economy from the ground up, in your opinion, with all the experience that you now have and all the thoughts in your head, how do we do that? And which sort of policies would you suggest we put in place to take us there?
Well, we are looking for a big transformation, not a superficial one, but fortunately, we can go there step by step. And as each step builds, we find eventually, if we follow those steps, we will get to system change. So for a start, as Marilyn Waring has indicated, we need a much broader set of well-being indicators, and these indicators must carry more weight than GDP, which is really very limited in the information it carries. We also need to do something that is heresy in the neoliberal ideology, and that is to introduce a planning commission which has input from community groups, from focus groups. And this planning commission can help develop an industry strategy, because in transforming the economy, some industries are going to have to decline, like fossil fuels, like the financial services industry, which is mostly based on gambling in the stock market, and many other destructive industries, while other industries are going to have to increase, such as renewable energy, the caring professions, and so on. So we need an industry strategy. We actually need some planning, and that planning needs input from the community if we're to change direction. And then specifically, what we really need is what can we offer the community that is going through these changes? And what we can offer them is what is called universal basic services or universal public services. And by this, we simply mean better public housing, public education, public health, public transport, better government support for caring for the elderly, for childcare, better support for public parks, and so on. So universal basic services are what the community, everyone, receives, and everyone will get the benefits, except possibly the super rich who feel they are doing okay as it is. And alongside universal basic services, we need a job guarantee for everyone who wants to work and yet isn't able to find a work in the market system. And there are so many things that need to be done in our community that the market does not reward. A lot of caring for the environment, caring for people is not rewarded by the market. And so a job guarantee funded by the federal government, the national government, is essential. And those jobs can be provided by all levels of government, but specifically by local government, and I would argue by community groups that are registered to provide those services. We can go further to assist worker rights and human rights, but particularly worker rights, which have been so weakened over the recent decades. So we need legislation, for example, to strengthen trade union rights, to strengthen the rights to protest, and right now in Australia, we're going in the opposite direction, and to foster the creation of cooperatives, which are a much more democratic form of business. And then we have to recognise that the greatest environmental impacts, in particular the greatest greenhouse gas emissions, are produced by the rich. And that means increasing taxation for the rich, whether it's a wealth tax or an inheritance tax or a pollution tax to discourage private planes and so on. So that's a very tough one to grab because the rich are already very powerful and they will scream. And I guess last but not least in my menu of steps, we have a situation where subsidies are going to polluters, to the fossil fuel industries, to the pharmaceutical industries, and so on. What we need to do is to shift those subsidies initially to help establish the clean and green businesses and industries. And we need to create a circular economy. And right now, the current economy is based on polluters not paying for the damage they are doing. And what we have to do is to shift that subsidy to the community so we can have a circular economy, or at least a nearly circular economy. So I believe that all these actions, all these steps are actually achievable, but they need to be driven by community groups from across the board coming together and forming alliances to demand action that will get these positives established, while at the same time campaigning against the methods used by vested interests to capture the nation state. We want particularly all the rich countries to end this notion of endless growth and rather look at the distribution of wealth and income within the community. And of course, we also need the rich countries to allow the poorer countries to develop, to undergo a green transition themselves and to fund that transition.
Let's talk a little bit about, Mark, how we finance all that. Because financing the green transition and what you talked about, the universal public services and so on, can seem like a bit of a mystery. Where do we find the money for that? Considering that we are in a crisis in so many ways and everyone's talking about a cost of living crisis. So where's the money going to come from?
Well, we're very fortunate that one of the other co-authors of our economic critique paper, Dr. Steven HailGlobal is able to discuss the question of financing the change as a real international expert.
The first bit is the easy bit. How does the government fund anything? All federal government spending happens in precisely the same way. It involves the Reserve Bank of Australia crediting private bank accounts and crediting those private banks' reserve balances with the amount the federal government is spending. Every dollar the federal government ever spends, and they spend at least a couple of $1 billion every day, is a new dollar, is the birth of a dollar. So it's not a question of where you go and find the money from. They create money every time there's any federal spending at all. And while people think of federal taxes as finding money for the government to spend, that's not right. Federal taxes destroy money that the government has previously spent into the system. Our federal government is not like the rest of us. It doesn't have a bank account where if it runs out of money in that bank account, it can't spend anymore, because it is the currency issuer. The point is that if the federal government wants to spend more money, and if it can pass bills through Parliament, then there is nothing stopping the federal government doing that.
What about the risk of inflation?
That is the key issue. If the government is competing for scarce resources, I mean real resources here, I mean what people and capital equipment are producing, what materials are being used to produce, what energy is being used to produce, then it will drive prices up. So what you need to do, if you want to engage in the sort of investments which would be necessary to decarbonise Australia's economy in a short period of time, is you need to do an audit of the state of the Australian economy as far as those real resources are concerned. What labour, including skilled labour, do we have available that's relevant? What technology or what capital equipment is available? What natural resources are available to us? What institutional capacity do we have? How could we manage the investments that we would need to make in order to create the infrastructure of a post-growth economy? And if you don't have some of those real resources at the moment, or if they're fully employed and the construction industry is close to full capacity at the moment, then you would need to free up some of those resources, which you could do partly through changing the way you regulate the banks in terms of the amount of lending they're allowed to do and what they're allowed to create credit for. You could use the planning system also to limit the forms of development which took place in our major cities, to free up some resources there that could be used for other purposes. There are, of course, sectors of our economy which we need to phase out over the next few years. That will free up some resources as well. Not that this is a simple thing to do, because those resources will not be perfectly occupationally mobile between the activities we're phasing out and the activities that we need to engage in. On top of that, an essay by Keynes during the Second World War called How to Pay for the War, which was published in 1940, which said, and remember this was after the Great Depression of the 1930s, when you would imagine Britain was basically bankrupted. It said there's no problem finding the pounds to fight the Second World War. The problem is that if we're producing all these things in our factories, we won't be able to produce the things which people would like to consume with the money that we're spending. So we need to ask people to save more of that money. And we could do something like this in Australia. There are some things, in other words, that it would be great to do now, but we may not be able to do now. That's why we need a thorough audit of our real resources as a country, so that we know what we might not be able to do now that we might be able to do in 5 years' time if we start planning for it now. These kind of things need to be discussed much more widely, and they should be right at the very centre of federal election campaigns.
So, in short, It's all very doable. However, here in Australia, we certainly need some strategies. We need to think about how can communities step in, you could say, and take over. You know, the state capture that has happened, the power of the vested interest is real. I think as communities, you know, as individuals, we sometimes feel very powerless, Mark. So what do we do?
Well, there's a story that a group of lobbyists once met with the American President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and after he listened to their arguments, he said, "Okay, you've convinced me. Now get out there and make me do it." So I guess what he's saying is reason, although it's necessary, reason alone is not going to change a politician's position. That reason has to be backed up by very strong community pressure. And what I'm proposing is that community groups in a whole range of different areas, environment, social justice, human rights, peace, public health, public housing, form alliances. And the strategy that I think is needed is two-pronged. It has two components. One component is to combat the power of the vested interests, and the other component is to push, to campaign for the positive steps that we've spoken about. There is hope, at least, that combined environment, public health, social justice, human rights, peace groups working together can challenge these methods used of state capture by powerful vested interests. And this is really the main theme of our book, The Path to a Sustainable Civilization. So I believe we can do it. And already there are groups in Australia and internationally that are trying to bring together the different interests in the community to campaign much more broadly. So one example is the campaigns for democracy. Democracy means the community makes the decisions. It's not just voting. In Australia, we have a relatively new group, the Australian Democracy Network, which has done fantastic work.
What would it look like if we actually succeeded in doing what you're saying? Let's say over the next 10 to 20 years. What would it look like? How would it feel?
Our new place would not be a utopia, but it would be a better society, a better civilization. It would protect the environment. It would be more socially equal, more socially just, have stronger human rights and worker rights, and it would be more peaceful.
Radio MMT. Economics for the Rest of Us with Anne
And Kev.
at 3CR Community Radio, Melbourne, Australia.
Swept away. I take and take a little more, and then I see that forest fall, and my garden was swept away. That love, it was swept away. It's really something big, brave. stand still. I watch as it's swept away.
That was Anthony and the Johnsons. Well, it was Anthony and the Johnsons, and he's changed his name to Anthony. But I knew him as Anthony and the Johnsons from a way back with a song called Breaking, which was just a nice song I heard. I thought I'd play it.
That was so nice.
It was nice, wasn't it? I don't know which direction I'm going to go in half the time, but that's what I've
I never know what song Kevin's going to play.
Who were we listening to before, Anne?
Well, we have to thank the Sustainable Hour for allowing us to play an excerpt from their podcast. And Kevin, as they said, it's just all so doable. It's right there in front of us.
I'm gonna be a bit of a Debbie Downer on this one.
Oh no! I'm trying to do the positive end of year thing here.
Yeah, well, yeah, okay, but let's also throw in a dose of reality here. I loved everything they said, and as you and I know, once you start analysing the system, you can find ways to fix the things which are wrong with it. Okay. What happened in the mid-70s is when the system started breaking apart, there was a group of economists who came in and said they could fix things. Unfortunately, they were the neoliberals. And when things break this time, you'd like to be able to think that the MMTers, who are now all over the world, this is an international movement of economists who have analysed the system, who have come at it from many different directions, who have all the answers, and they don't get heard. They just don't get heard. We're a fringe group, you know. We're here on 3CR presenting to very few people. Meanwhile, the mainstream media keeps on trotting out its misinformation, which has all of the attention, even though it's fundamentally flawed, even though it makes no sense. That it won't be challenged.
You heard Mark Diesendorf say the mainstream media ignored their book.
Yeah, you know, and there's all these ways that we could change things. Then you have some good-looking Italian-American shoots a CEO of a health fund, and all of a sudden there's worldwide interest in inequality. But
that interest might be sitting up and saying, well, now, what do we do about it? And they'll be looking around for the answers.
Well, yeah, except you have to look at history, okay? So if you have a look at history, have a look at the history of Australian politics, and we've got the Curtin-Chifley government finished in 1948 when they decide to nationalise the banks, and that's just seen as a step towards socialism, so they get rid of. And then we have decades of Menzies, Conservative government, and he gradually winds back any kind of progressive policy that can be. A little brief moment of progressive, what would you call it, wildness was with Whitlam, comes in between 72 and 75. And he introduces a lot of things that we hold near and dear, universal basic services like universal healthcare, free education. And he is attacked and sabotaged from the day go, so that by the end of it, Bill Hayden, his treasurer, is starting to introduce neoliberal policies as dictated by Milton Friedman at the time. So the one radical progressive that we had, who was only there for 3 years, the last part of his term was adopting the conservative agenda to try and hold some semblance of power. So where do we go from there? We then have Malcolm Fraser, who ran an austerity program, and he was the guy that undermined Whitlam. It was conspiracy. It was a way to undo the democratic process. Followed by Hawke and Keating. Hawke and Keating did some socially progressive things, but economically they were conservative. Followed by Howard, conservative as they get. Followed by Rudd and Gillard, which again socially they try some stuff, but nothing significant. Followed by Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison, and now we've got Albanese, who is in trouble because bald-headed guy, but he Dutton is now seen as competitive. So what you see is a political system which is absolutely, well, it's in the hands of the conservative forces.
So you're taking stock here, which is always good to do at the end of the year.
Yeah, and so I just sort of see that the narrative has been very successfully controlled and delivered by the Conservatives, and any progressive challenge to that just seems ineffective. Like I can't see how significant change is going to come unless there's a catastrophe to preempt it, something like a major climate change issue.
Well, we saw that happen already with the COVID pandemic. They had to switch gears pretty quick to deal with the reality of the fact that they had to take on the payroll of the nation. So a Conservative government started spending big.
Yeah, so we've seen it would take a catastrophe for the narrative to change, And so I come back to this a good-looking Italian guy in the States who's knocked off a CEO. You go back through history, the Russian Revolution was preempted by decades of nobility being shot dead in their carriages. There's already been two shots taken at Trump. But you're beginning to see, I'm not endorsing this, right? Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying if you look at history, what you see is that when things reach a certain point, you will provoke a reaction. And tinkering at the edges in politics is not delivering the solutions that are required. So
No, I'm not so sure what electoral politics could do for us, although it is one avenue to look at. But I think what my optimism is based on is something Mark Diesendorf said, which he said, you take a few steps, and if you keep taking them, you will end up with system change. Although I will admit that it seems like what we're facing is, effectively 500 years of capitalism, and we've never managed to, wrest control of the state back from, the capital class. But, the thing is that an economy that is doing what we need to do to face global warming, in other words, an economy that is degrowing towards a sustainable circular economy, is also an economy that would be very pleasant to live in, and people like Luigi would be very happy to live in it, because we would have universal basic services. We would have no one left behind due to medical problems or disability or being a single parent or any of that. And as Mark said, we would have stronger worker rights. We would have guaranteed income through jobs or a stronger social safety net. And we would stop subsidising the polluters and start subsidising the things that we want, as well as offering reparations from wealthy countries to poorer countries. So to me, it's like we are living in a system that seems immovable, but the fact that it's a system means that once you start tinkering, you can potentially flip the whole system.
I can't see the system flipping cooperatively. And the thing is, like, there's been revolutions before, and the whole thing about communism I find fascinating, because that's a class war that was obvious, and I think is still pertinent today. But if you say the word socialist or communist, you're regarded as some sort of a freaky radical.
That's the success of their propaganda.
Yeah, I'll give you a simple example of I've kind of shifted from calling myself ideologically a socialist to ideologically being a communist, and let me explain it in very simple terms.
Okay.
You've got a state that has natural resources, and if you dig up those resources, there's opportunity available. So let's say Western Australia is full of minerals and it needs to improve its roads and its education and its health system. If the state took control of those resources and sold them to whoever they wanted to, the state would be better resourced to manage some of its internal spending. Remembering that a state needs to find its own revenue. It's not a revenue creator. But what we've decided in this system, that it's better to give all that wealth and opportunity to a single person,
a few individuals,
a single person, rather than it is to. And when we say it's our country, that's a tenuous statement, of course, because of the whole colonialism thing. But if you talk about the state owning the means of production, you're now a communist. So if I said that the state government of Western Australia should own its operations and that wealth should flow through the government to the people, I'm now a communist.
Right.
Well, I'm happy with that. so I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's a really good idea.
Walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, Kevin.
Yeah. So then you have to start saying, okay, so ideologically, where do you sit? And if you explained this to people in the right way, they get it. But here's the problem. The problem is you often hear politicians say, never underestimate the intelligence of the electorate. I would say the exact opposite. Never underestimate the ignorance of the electorate. They are caught up in a system where they are not allowed to think more than one or two steps ahead. And they have this little carrot dangled in front of them. It might be a better job, a small pay rise. Lovely people, don't get me wrong. But
that's a whole other issue, which is that keeping people deliberately underpaid and overworked, so you've got to have 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet, or you're just working a 40-hour week or whatever it is. The tenuousness and the precariousness of how we treat workers, I think it's a design feature, not a design bug, because that does keep you too busy and too stressed out to actually being an active citizen.
Yeah, you've got no time for it. And what's more, your situation is so fragile that you're just saying, just don't change anything because I'm only just hanging in here.
So that's why something like a job guarantee and universal basic services, that's why they would flip the system, because they might look like just social programs, but what they would be doing is giving people back their time and their energy.
You don't have to convince me of the merits of programs like that. I totally agree with you. But the problem is that getting that message out is going to be fought tooth and nail by the orthodoxy. You know,
first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you.
Yeah, and I reckon they're winning. Like, just take a look at an effective protest group, Extinction Rebellion. I think they do marvellous work. I think they really caught the headlines, etc. What was the response? State governments around Australia increased the fines and penalties against them to make it just horrendous. Now, you've got people who are trying to literally save the world, and the governments come in and say, no, we have vested interests and that's more important, so we're going to lock you up if you even think about it. And that's what we're dealing with is vested interests who have successfully for decades controlled the message, control the governments, and all we're left with is a little program like this on a little station. And so, I don't know, I think our role is...
Yes. What is our role, Kevin?
Our role is to provide a safe haven for like-minded people, just so that you realise you're not alone. Right. But we are like a little outlier.
I see us as keeping this little flame alive.
Little flame going. I know. And I loved everything that was said in that interview. I thought the ideas they said were great. I thought the intent was great. And maybe I'm getting a bit jaded. And then a good-looking Italian called Luigi just says enough. And then all of a sudden everybody's attention there. So how does this work? Do we need to push enough people like that over the edge so that not endorsing it, not endorsing it, just noting that the effective reaction seems to come from dramatic action. That's quick, sharp and immediate.
Well, keeping that flame alive, that is about talking about these kinds of solutions that might seem pie in the sky and they might seem far away. But, I mean, every action starts with an idea, Kevin.
True. Yeah, and that's why we're here, and that's why I haven't just ridden off into the sunset all the time.
He's provoking me, people.
I'm not provoking you. Look, and I will say this: do go and check out the sunset. Go and have a look around the place because it's a beautiful world. We live in a beautiful world, and we're living at the end of a glorious period. Explore it and enjoy it while you can, because it ain't going to be here forever, and neither are we. So
it's a beautiful.
That's a Devo song. Devo. They did their last ever concert ever at the Palais in St Kilda, and I bought a ticket to it, and I got like one of the last tickets to the last show that they ever did. I didn't realise it was their last show. But
well, speaking of last, this is our last few minutes of 2024 with Radio MMT. Thank you for listening through the year, and thank you for spreading the word about, the fact that the government can never run out of dollars. If everyone understood that much, I think we'd be a long way ahead.
And come back and feel safe with us having these conversations again next time, and keep the flame alive. You never know. Something might happen and then we might take over. Who knows? So keep it going. Nice to speak to you again, and see you again. We'll do it again in a couple of weeks next year, but until then,
we'll be back on January 10.
Back to January 10. See you then. Bye, Anne.
See ya. You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime wherever you get your podcasts, or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, no, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gun Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, like, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. Like, we could deliver this whole message by music.
Well, we could call the band the permanent income hypothesis, or the Ricardian equivalence, or rational expectations.
I think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to form this band and sing it to them. And we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get music.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.